Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again. This is the Apprenticeship Insights podcast. My name is Vinh. It's good to be back. And with me, as per usual, is Bally, Bhogal of the Alex Group, the Managing Director. Also with us, we have Judy Gibbs on here for the first time. Judy, thank you so much for joining us. As it is your first time, if you'd like to tell us a bit about yourself, please.
Hello, my name is Judy Gibbs. I am Director of Skills at the Worcestershire Local Enterprise Partnership, but I also work in the Worcestershire County Council Local Authority, and there I lead a number of teams around skills.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Bally, again, great to have you on board for this podcast. How are things with you?
Yeah, really busy. Vinh, lovely to have your company again, as well as Judy. So it's really good to be doing this with Judy for the first time. Yeah, I'm fresh back from the national conference, the AELP conference. So that's Association of Employment and Learning Providers, in case anybody listening doesn't know what the AELP stands for. It's an acronym for. So yeah, just fresh back from that conference, which happened yesterday. So I'm looking forward to this podcast, Future of Apprenticeships, because I think it's pretty apt now, especially given that we have the election all but a few days away. So looking forward to this discussion with Judy today.
Sounds fantastic, and looking forward to hearing insights from you both. Having said that, if we're going to look towards the future of apprenticeships and what that entails, we'll now need to look back into the past a bit. So I was wondering, apprenticeships were reformed around 2017 to 2018. I'm just wondering what the impact of those reforms were, Bally. What would you say the impact was of those reforms?
It's a real tough one. It's a brilliant question, isn't it? What's been the impact of the reforms? Obviously, we all knew apprenticeships before 2017 in various guises. We all know that once political parties take over from another party, they all have different strategies, policies, and that impacts programs and funding and operations on the ground, if you like. And one of the most significant sets of reforms we had around apprenticeships was in 2017. What was the impact of that? So I'll just give you a few examples in terms of what happened around 2017. If people listening in, you know, they're not from the sector or they weren't around at that time, or it's something new, they've not really been in the sector from that time. So around 2017, there was all sorts of reforms. One of them was the introduction of apprenticeship standards. So these are, if you like, programs that are created by employers for employers, signed, sealed, stamped with the authority of stakeholders, sort of government regulators, to be delivered by apprenticeship training providers. So it's just a different marketplace. And then there was also the introduction of endpoint assessment. So almost like as if you go for a driving test, you learn with an instructor, you get tested with a driving assessor examiner who's different to your instructor, sort of that kind of model and analogy that came in. All sorts of different rules and regulations that came in. The impact, I mean, what's been the impact of those changes, those significant changes that almost really stalled the marketplace at that time? I don't know if Judy would agree, but in my opinion, having been there at the time and seen it through to this point, I think there's been a lot more rules and regulation and red tape, a lot more bureaucracy. And I think that's been to manage a lot of risk and protect the public purse and funding. There's been a lot less funding sloshing around, I think, for apprenticeships than probably originally anticipated. That's probably because the cost of living has really gone up in the past 2-3 years as well. So that's added to it. Nobody would have known at that time that there was COVID around the corner. So that just made delivery of apprenticeships really difficult. But I think the reforms have allowed more purchasing control. So basically put the purchasing decisions in the hands of the employers, you know, whether they choose to take it up or not. I think that's definitely been a big change. A lot less admin, I'd add, probably for the regulators. So a lot more digital services, help desks for running apprenticeships, lots more systems, procedures, you know, frameworks, all sorts of digital services, if you like, more admin for training providers. Frankly, that's created. And probably the last one I'd mention, I'd love to hear what Judy's got to add to this. I think there's been a lot more onus on employers and line managers to get involved with apprentices and really facilitate the apprenticeship, help to embed the apprenticeship and the learning, and to be the eyes and ears on the ground. So I think some employers have really got on board with that, and a lot of employers also probably haven't. So I think that's the first sort of immediate things that come to my mind.
Thanks, Bally. And you did mention bureaucracy, but then you also mentioned a lot of benefits as to the reforms to apprenticeships. But Judy, I also wanted to get your perspective on this from your background. What kind of impact do you think the reforms to apprenticeships has had, in your opinion?
I think, there's a plus and there's a minus. So the positives are it made apprenticeships really focused on the job. So actually the transition to standards was really positive. It became about being a customer service advisor. It became about being a help desk practitioner, whatever it might have been. That was really positive. And I think actually the fact that employers were more involved in setting the standards, again, really positive, because actually from a sort of perspective of curriculum led by employers, really being able to run with it on the ground, some real positives. I think the other thing for me that was a real positive was the introduction of the levy. In a sense, yes, it brought some bureaucracy, but actually it made some of those larger employers who had to pay a percentage of their wage bill into their levy actually sit up and really consider their strategies around apprenticeships, which was a real positive. Some of them were perhaps using a lot of apprenticeships in the past, but also I suppose one of the reasons the government brought it in was you had organisations that were using apprenticeships as a bit of a free induction. So actually now kind of there was a bit of them actually having to put some finance behind that as well. But I think for some of those particularly large, you think of some of the public sector organisations like the NHS, like local authorities, this was a positive because it made them think about their workforce plan. It made them think about how they would use apprenticeships in a really positive way to kind of excel their workforce in the future. So the approach was right. Absolutely, I believe that. I think the approach was right. However, it also brought some challenges, the bureaucracy for sure, and some confusion. So I think the bureaucracy around applying the levy for a number of organisations was really challenging. Actually, public sector, and I can use as an example within that, it took us quite a long time to get our head around how to do that, how to use that money, how to pass that money on to other employers. And we're a large organisation, so therefore, in terms of that decision-making process, that's a lot slower than it would have been in a small and medium enterprise. So I think whilst there was a real positive, that time taken affected the numbers and it affected the opportunities that were out there for young people. And actually, I think that affected on a longer term, actually how young people perceived apprenticeships, because actually perhaps at the point when they were wanting to consider them, there didn't seem to be as many opportunities because a lot of those larger employers were taking their time to get their head around it. And that then meant that they thought, well, there's no available opportunities. So actually it probably drove at that point a bit of an increase of young people choosing other opportunities as opposed to apprenticeships. Certainly in Worcestershire, I think the real thing for us was actually we are a county of small and medium enterprises. We're a county of SMEs, and actually our SMEs weren't able to, they didn't pay the levy. They weren't necessarily able at that point to get access to apprenticeships because the way the government initially set it up was very much around levy payers and levy payer funding to fund apprenticeships. But the second sort of stage of that was about bringing on providers that could support the small and medium enterprises, but there was less capacity. So therefore, actually our small and medium enterprises were really impacted in the first phase because there wasn't a lot of places to go to get that delivery. And again, that probably impacted the way that those SMEs felt about apprenticeships. I think the knock-on impact in the long term for small and medium enterprises was actually that they hadn't designed the standards. They'd been involved, some of them, through supply chains of those larger organisations, but quite a significant number hadn't been. So actually, how relevant were a number of those standards to them? Did it really do what it was designed to do, which is to deliver a curriculum that would be really employer focused, or actually did it just miss the point a little bit? And I think for some of our small and medium enterprises, and I can use the example of the springs industry in Redditch, actually the engineering standards just didn't really hit what they needed. And at that point, I think they hadn't developed some of them as well. So again, actually they were trying to get them into more management posts as opposed to the operational posts that they really required. So that really impacted us. And the overall impact actually across Worcestershire was a significant decrease in that first year of apprenticeships that, if I'm honest, we are still recovering from.
That is a pretty significant impact, Judy. And there were a couple of points that you raised in particular that really stood out, especially when considering what would be my next question, considering what do employers really want from apprenticeships? And the most obvious one, and this is in accordance to your point as well, Bally, let's cut down the bureaucracy, please. I think that's something we can all agree on. And also something more for your area, Judy, was at least more involvement from small to medium enterprises. So, Judy, the question to you then would be, what do employers really want from apprenticeships, would you say?
I think so, thinking about large businesses, what do they want? I think some of our, if we look at the NHS, we look at local authority in Worcestershire, what do we want from apprenticeships? We want to use it really positively to support our workforce planning. That's absolutely what we want it for. In terms of can we get the curriculum that we need? And I think the NHS and local authorities often have these roles that are really important to us, but not necessarily important to the wider marketplace. So planning is always one where actually we'd really like apprentices in planning, but actually there's not very many places that do those standards. So we struggle to kind of use it in a really useful way for those areas where we have some skill shortages. However, in areas like social care and social work, we are using that levy really positively. We've got a new programme starting this year where we've got a number of people who've kind of been within our workplace who we are now progressing to be social work apprentices, and that's a real positive for us because actually that's an area where we really require a stronger workforce. So I think a lot of larger employers have really taken it on positively and looked at some of that workforce planning piece. Having said that, I do think there are a lot of larger employers, and we definitely have some who still very much see it as a tax. And actually, they're quite willing to forego actually having an apprenticeship because they'd just rather just pay the money because of the bureaucracy. So I do think there's still something that needs to be done about how that levy is informed. I also think when it comes to the levy transfer, actually, that's a job. That's a job in itself, being able to manage levy transfer. And a lot of the larger employers, again, actually, there's a corporate social responsibility value, but are they willing to invest in that in a fairly difficult climate? Not sure. So I think it can be really challenging for some of our larger as well as our smaller. And if it's impacting our larger, it's certainly impacting our smaller businesses. I think a lot of our smaller businesses want to utilise apprenticeships, and I think they are really keen to see it as not just a vehicle for planning new entrants into their workforce, but also for that upskilling piece. I'm really passionate about apprenticeships being for that entry into the workforce. I think it's absolutely the way that we should be embedding that within our county and for our employers. We don't always get that. Of course, we do get a number of people who want to train their existing staff. But again, that's a real positive. If it's meaning that they're being trained, they're being upskilled, and then there's an opportunity for a younger person to come in underneath them. I'm really keen to see that.
Thank you, Judy. Looking forward to hearing of the inevitable successes which come out of that. Bally, you as well, you've worked with a countless number of employers. What would you say employers really want from apprenticeships?
Judy's made some brilliant points. I absolutely, love some of the points that she's made. And I think if I were to just sort of almost summarize some of the stuff that I was going to say that I think Judy sort of touched upon in her examples, employers just want good quality programs. They want them to be relevant. They want them to deliver good candidates. They want them to deliver, a fully fledged employee at the end of it, somebody who's competent, confident, capable, independent, almost a self-starter, self-initiated. I think we have to appreciate that all businesses, regardless of their size, are hungry for time. They need that efficiency. So they need people that are really well trained, confident. But then that's not going to come without the input of the actual employer. So that comes with a caveat from my end, that to get to that point, I think employers have to open their eyes and have to be willing as well to get their hands dirty, if you like, really roll up the sleeves and get involved with the apprentices and apprenticeship programs and helping to design it. I think Judy's mentioned such a brilliant point there in terms of, for example, planning apprenticeships. I mean, if you can't get the provider, if you can't get training providers to deliver these, and sometimes for training provider, it is very much, if you look at it, a commercial perspective, are they going to get enough, for want of a better phrase, like bums on seats, to be able to make it viable and feasible to run that program? And frankly, if the answer is no to that, you won't get training providers unless they get the numbers and the volumes to make it viable to deliver that program up or down the country, let alone in your local kind of vicinity. So it has to work for them, regardless of whether the standard, that syllabus, if you like, that has been scoped, that has been prepared by larger employers and some input from smaller, or otherwise, whether it's there or not. So there's that. But employers definitely want to see good quality training providers as well, not just candidates. And that can be tough. They want to see that they're reliant, that they're trustworthy, they're capable, that they've got the expertise as well to deliver on the promises, and that they're in their right, that their employees are in the right training providers' hands. So I think they need to give that confidence. So there's a lot of work from training providers' perspective as well, to be able to be to put themselves in a really good position to win that business, if you like. So analytics, for example, that's massive nowadays from training providers. They should have those analytics. They should have the business analytics, program specific analytics, success stories, case studies, video, and have those stories ready, that this is what we're able to do with our programs for you, Mr. or Mrs. or whomever employer. And that's what we bring to this party, give us the opportunity to work with you. And then in there has to be this whole value for money conversation and the return on investment. Employers have to be willing to know that if they take on new candidates, or if they're training their existing staff, that there is going to be some loss of that staff time whilst at work to training. But loss as in inverted commas, that you should see that loss as an investment, in as much as we are investing in this person. That's why we're giving that time. That is our contribution. We'll find a way of backfilling or what have you, their post, or if it's a new position, obviously, supporting that individual to be embedded. So employers want value for money. They want to see the return on investment, but they also have to work for it. And just good communications, good relationships and productivity. Now, on the whole notion around productivity, I don't know if I did mention that I've come from the AELP conference yesterday, and there were about 500 representatives from apprenticeship training providers per se. And between them, they run apprenticeship programs, study programs, being involved in boot camps, all of that, and are. So they were saying, and there was a big presentation which showed that in amongst like the leading world nations, UK is seriously running behind on productivity. So whatever apprenticeships can do to deliver on productivity, to get ahead, is where we need to be. And that's what I think employers want from apprenticeships.
So as a follow-up question to that, Bally, what is it in policy right now that needs to change in order to facilitate those changes to deliver those needs to employers briefly?
Gosh, that's really a tough question. I mean, obviously, we're on the verge of a general election, so it remains to be seen. If I can share with some of the anecdotes from 500 people's perspective at the conference yesterday, and they are colleagues of ours from the sector, policy really needs to look at being to really deliver on those promises that apprenticeships is something that we take seriously as a country. And I think the UK, England definitely need to put a stamp on apprenticeships have to float to the top. Like, I don't think we have that parity of kind of that level playing field still with academic routes, if you like. That's what I was trying to think of, sort of academic routes. So, your GCSEs into A levels, into university, that is well defined, has been defined, and it continues to be defined. I think now there's a big question around the value of university education and whether or not you get, it pays back dividends. So I think that's changing. But if you look at some of the public opinion around policy, what the public expect, there were some brilliant statistics yesterday, in as much as, these are actual polls that have been run, thousands and thousands of people have responded. And one of the questions was around, again, what do you want to see change in education so that politicians deliver on it? Public are saying that we'd like to see, the question was, what would you like to see implemented by political parties? And 30% of respondents, and that was the joint highest proportion, said we'd like to see an increase in the number of apprenticeships available to young adults and also adults in the country. And that was the highest. It came joint 30% with serious change in primary education, where you've got more teachers and teaching staff. So that was really reassuring in that that's what the public want. And that's what the polls are suggesting now. When you look at where should political parties prioritise educational spend, 20% of people said in employment and job support. And then the last question, which I found really interesting, and it was the highest rating, there was no further in terms of a proportion. What areas of post-18 spending would you like to see? Where would you like to see post-18 spend prioritised by political parties? And 44% of public opinion, people that responded to the poll, said more apprenticeships for people that are over the age of 18. So there's a lot of public support for apprenticeships. I think there's still a lot of confusion around apprenticeships of what they actually deliver. I think people still see them as a course as opposed to as a integrated program of learning that you do at work to learn a job, to learn the occupation, as Judy mentioned, to then be proficient in that job and then to have a job for life or however long you want it to be, but then to progress in that career as a kind of pathway. So I think, how does policy need to change? There needs to be a lot more emphasis, in short, on apprenticeships. And I think politicians also need to deliver on simplification, better mapped pathways from programs such as study skills bootcamp. I know that Judy is an expert on all of that stuff. I probably see myself more as an expert in apprenticeships, but study skills, boot camps, adult skills, I know that she's an absolute whiz at all that sort of stuff. So I think better route ways is what I'd say.
I was going to ask yourself, Judy, as well, just briefly. Again, your perspective is so valuable on this particular subject when it comes to policy. Now, just briefly, what parts of policy do need to change to deliver what employers need, in your opinion?
I think there's something around funding, isn't there? So there's something around funding flexibility. So one of the things that we're seeing in Worcestershire at the moment is a real diminishing picture of level twos, so of intermediate apprenticeships. And actually, for a lot of employers, particularly some of those small and medium companies, they really need those level twos. They need those entry points into their organisation. I mean, for me, I feel it is absolutely crazy that we've decided not to do business administration anymore. I mean, so many organizations, as a young person starting in that organization, you start in a kind of administration officer role, and yet actually now that is not something that we're able to put someone on an apprenticeship. So we're putting a round peg in a square hole by making it, I don't know, customer service or something else. But actually, what is wrong with acknowledging that a lot of young people coming out of academia, coming out of education, don't necessarily have the right administration skills? And actually, I still think that's a really valuable starting point for a young person going into a business, and that's not there. So I think there's a bit around funding flexibility. Certainly a lot of my providers are reporting with the intermediates, actually it's not affordable for them anymore because those rates haven't changed for such a long time. It's not affordable for them to deliver them, and I think that's something that needs to be quickly addressed to kind of bring those funding levels up to where they need to be to get those routes back in there, because that is absolutely what's stalling a number of young people. And more than that, I think actually it's affecting some of our communities more than others, because actually some of our disadvantaged young people would have been looking at those level 2s. And actually, if they're not there, those intermediate routeways are not there, they can't necessarily, they may not have the education, they might not have the English and maths to be able to progress onto those level 3s. That doesn't mean they're not vocationally competent, they don't have that vocational skill, but because they haven't done well in English and maths, then actually we're going to just dismiss that they could even do an apprenticeship. So I suppose the other thing that potentially needs to change is either something around entry requirements, or perhaps, as Bally mentioned, that route way from things like traineeships. And again, there's no policy around traineeships at the moment. That was something that's been eradicated. But you can do a traineeship through another means on a 16 to 19 study program. So actually, we need those better route ways that progress young people that might not quite be right for an apprenticeship at this time, but get them on a vehicle that will get them the English and maths in a contextualized way, give them some work experience, get them able to then go forward for that apprenticeship interview. And at the moment, that's there, but it is a bit clunky, and it needs a better look at that to kind of really get that working. I'm also really passionate about young people who have EHCPs, and I think supported internships is a great route way for young people who have EHCPs to get into the world of work with a lot of support. And again, for me, I would like to see that all of those young people coming off a supported internship, particularly into organisations like the NHS, are actually then supported to consider doing an apprenticeship within the NHS following that. But at the moment, again, I don't think those conversations are necessarily there, and they're not always the same providers, so they're not necessarily joined up. They're not always the same people in those employers that are looking after, that are mentoring those young people. So again, they're not always joined up, those conversations. So I think there's something to do there. And I think the other one that I know Bally will agree is just flexibility around the paperwork. Unfortunately, we have put a lot of bureaucracy in there, and we need to kind of strip as much of that back as we can at this point.
Thank you, Judy. Apart from those points as well, was there anything else you felt that has limited apprenticeship growth, and anything else at all? What would you also change about apprenticeships to actually eradicate those barriers and accelerate growth of apprenticeships, would you say?
I think one of the things I would do, I think there's been such a lot of change in this agenda that actually that's possibly confused a lot of the messaging, particularly for young people. We talk about this in Worcestershire quite a lot because you've got a lot of players in the market. You've got kind of all the government messaging, you've got your training providers, you've got your schools and the role they play, you've got your parents and what they remember from back in the day when they kind of were offered an apprenticeship. And then you've got your employers. And actually, I think you've got a lot of different voices in a conversation. We need to come back to a vehicle that talks about apprenticeships on a national basis, or like we have on a local basis. We have a local brand called Worcestershire Apprenticeships, and that's all about being an impartial brand offering advice and guidance to employers, to young people, to parents around apprenticeships. We need more of that in order to guide young people through what is a very confusing landscape, I think. So a bit of simplification of that. I also get a little bit concerned, we've obviously now recently added the higher apprenticeships onto the UCAS system, which, great, real positive for a lot of our larger organisations. Absolutely fantastic that they're going to be able to kind of direct young people rather than going through a university route, which has its merits, absolutely, but also looking at whether they would want to consider a higher apprenticeship. But my concern with that is actually, have we forgotten perhaps some of the original purpose of apprenticeships around those entry roles, around getting some of those individuals into those organisations at a starting point and allowing them to progress? I'm a big fan of higher apprenticeships. I absolutely think that they have a purpose. I think there's a little bit of confusion still out there about there, because you can't do some higher apprenticeships. You do need to do some of this building blocks before them. But I feel that there is also a piece about that original purpose, and actually, are we moving away from that? Are we making apprenticeships too exclusive? Are we in danger of moving away from supporting on intermediate and advanced apprenticeships and those real important vehicles for small and medium companies? An element of concern there as well.
Judy, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it always pays to look back and re-refer back to what the original purpose was of apprenticeships, because again, referring back to the concerns around bureaucracy, it is really easy to get swamped up in all the paperwork and all the guidance and legislation, which is constantly changing anyhow. But yes, I couldn't agree with you more. It really is helpful to go back to the purpose of apprenticeships and what people are looking to gain from them. Bally, the question is the same for you in your experience. What has limited apprenticeship growth, and what would you change about that to accelerate that growth, which has been limited?
I think Judy's just hit the nail on the head. It's way too complex, the marketplaces. Like she's just said, too many voices, there's just too many opinions, too many stakeholders, too many politicians, and then it changes every so often. Change is good, but change for the sake of just changing things is not good. And I think what we find in our sector is that it changes so often that actually you don't get the opportunity to drive certain changes forward and to evaluate them. So for example, even with these reforms, if we go back to 2017 and 18, and Judy, feel free to interject if I'm wrong, but the whole idea of implementing those reforms was to increase the quality of apprenticeship programs and also obviously, you know, take up of all employers. There was never any kind of prediction in terms of how it would go. Introduction of the levy, plus we want for the quality of the programs to be improved. That was definitely there as some of those intentions at the start for the reforms. Whether or not they've come good, I think Judy's already mentioned that some employers have happily embraced the apprenticeship levy. They've kind of stopped to understand it. They've thought, okay, how can we develop our workforce, etc. Others have just thought, can't be asked to engage with all of this. We don't really want to play, and we're happy to just write it off as a tax. So has that worked? I don't know. And then if you look at the quality of the programs, have they actually improved? We don't actually have any analytics or any definitive data on whether or not the reforms have actually positively impacted the quality of apprenticeships. And I don't know if Judy has got something. I know that she works at a local authority. She might have something that, you know, I'm not party to or that I've not seen out there in the public domain, but there's actually no specific data set that I've seen. So then it begs the question, if this marketplace is there as it is now, is it useful for the purpose of growing apprenticeships? And then you get these little green shoots where you've got the UCAS and the higher level, which is great for parents. I'm a parent as well of a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old. And at some point we're going to have the discussion. In fact, we're having them sort of now around, okay, what do you want to do in the future? And of course, me being me, I would bring up apprenticeships with my own kids. And versus, you know, university, what are you thinking? Where would you like to be? What are you, and give them a very objective but very insightful reality check in terms of this is how you could progress through apprenticeships and work-based learning programs, and this is how you could progress through academic routes, and basically the choice is yours. But equally give a very real overview in terms of sort of costs, etc., of cost benefits of both pathways. I think one point I wanted to make about the UCAS system and the higher apprenticeships, I think it sounds great in reality and it's brilliant, but frankly we forget that the availability of higher apprenticeship programs is very limited. So it's, whilst higher apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships are a growing proportion, they're a growing part of the apprenticeship marketplace, they're never going to grow exponentially enough to feed all of the children coming out of school that want to go on to do degrees and do an apprenticeship at the same time, you know, unless, again, I'm not party to a data set. I just don't see that happening. Frankly, you'd need businesses to offer up job positions at a higher level to young people that have come straight out of school or straight out of sixth form onto, you know, level 5, 6, whatever, 7 programs. And the likelihood of that happening is very slim. Very, very slim, and you do need those level 2 programs. I mean, I wanted to interject, but I was listening to Judy really carefully about the business admin, and the business admin level 2 was one of the best bridges we had to bring anybody from academia into the life of the world of work, and for that to go was a big shock. It was a big loss. And I think it has limited individuals' routeways into work. So I think that was a great loss to all of us, sectors, people, advisors, practitioners, all of us as a sector. That definitely limited the growth, I think. But if you look at yesterday's conference as well, training providers were asked, what is it that you really want from going forward when we look forward to apprenticeships? And actually 40% of the attendees there, and this was the top kind of rating, floated right to the top of the bar chart, just basically said we want an apprenticeship system that works and delivers for businesses and learners. They're not saying that we want growth for ourselves. They're not actually saying we want funding caps lifted, all of the rest of it. They're just saying we actually want something that works for our learners and works for our businesses. And that's really commendable from our sector, which clearly shows that the apprenticeship marketplace as it is broken. It is fragmented. There's too many opinions, too many rules, too many regulations. And I personally think it really needs to be simplified to hopefully open up that pipeline to growing and developing apprenticeships. Frankly, in my opinion, as a parent, as a practitioner from this industry, as a trainer, consultant, auditor, whatever you want to think of me as a critical friend, I really think that, apprenticeships, I'm so bought into this. And I'm going to say that I disagree with the policy that's been put forward potentially, which is around, everybody should do national community service. Frankly, they should say that everybody should do apprenticeship to really gain an idea of what they want to do, how they want to progress in their careers. And I think that's, for me, it would never happen, but that's ideally, I'd love that to be not a choice, almost a mandatory requirement that all students leaving school at GCSE and at A level should somehow either be put on a mandatory apprenticeship or certainly go through some kind of checkpoint where they've actually had a definitive conversation, which is signed, sealed, and it's been concluded that it's not really a pathway for them, so that check and balance has been done. Sorry, a very long answer and convoluted answer to a very short question. I don't even know if I've answered the question, but there you go.
I think you have, Bally, and the more comprehensive answer, the better, just to provide more, as the podcast suggests, more insights for all the listeners out there. You did make some references in regards to what's going to happen next, in regards to, as the podcast title suggests, the future of apprenticeships. And you also mentioned the lack of data available. And of course, as we have determined in previous podcasts, data-driven decisions is always, I would say, the best way to approach any issues. If we don't have the data, then how on earth are we going to grow apprenticeships? Having said that, Bally, what do you foresee in the future of apprenticeships, would you say? What's going to happen? What are your predictions for the future?
I think if you're asking me which political party is going to gain power, I actually have no idea. I can only go on the kind of polls. I did a quick check just now, just ahead of coming onto this podcast, and there's some reputable sources, BBC and Telegraph, sort of favouring, or polls are suggesting that Labour will be taking control. And if that happens, they'll bring in Skills England, inverted commas, as a kind of new committee, if you like, or some kind of forum to bring together businesses and training providers, unions and national, local government to ensure that, they've got a workforce for the future that delivers on the industrial strategy. I don't know, that could become really convoluted. I think it would be another kind of government quango. Whether or not it actually delivers, I couldn't say. But I think everything that we've said, that, the simplification needs to happen. For me, I think the biggest thing that is missing, that I would really love to see happen, is whoever takes control of the politics and the government next, that there's more involvement from employers in the future. That's what I would like to see happen. Can I predict that? I think there is a bit of noise around that there's certainly more noise from sort of Ofsted inspectors. Even if you look at some of the standards where they're taking away mandatory qualifications. So when you're left with the standards, so a syllabus to deliver, you then have to look at your partnerships with employers in terms of, okay, we have this outline and we would like to deliver this. How best can we work with you to flesh it out so that it's applicable to you? So I'd like to think that there's going to be more involvement from employers in apprenticeships at an operational level, hands-on level, when mentoring, coaching apprentices, helping to develop those and design their curriculum with their actual selected provider to make it really applicable and useful to learners as well as the employers. That's what I'd like to see happen, I guess, whomever takes over.
And of course, finally, Judy, to yourself, what do you predict will happen to apprenticeships in the future from your perspective?
So I think the one thing I haven't mentioned is I think there's been some real positive change. And one of those things that for me has been a real positive change, and it's kind of evolving, I would say, over the last kind of 2 to 3 years, is a number of organisations are actually really positively using apprenticeships to put entrance on the ground into their organisations, in a sense of, so looking at things like paramedicine as an example. So, we've all seen it on the telly, I'm sure. When you used to watch the ambulance programme, you used to see the kind of 2 people side by side. They were both paramedics. If you've noticed, what you would notice is that one of them is a paramedic and the other person's actually, they're a paramedicine apprentice. And I think they've had a number of individuals on there talking about that. And actually what that's done is it's put boots on the ground. So instead of being in a university doing that education, and I have no issue with that at all, but instead of doing that, it's put boots on the ground, and it's meant that actually it's benefiting our public services in that sense. So I think that's a real positive, and I'd like to see that continue. I'd really like to see actually us embrace it a little bit more through public sector. At one point there was, and we had it for a while, a little bit of a public sector target. I'd like it to go a little bit further. I'd really like public sector to be challenged on how they make apprenticeships work within their organisations as succession plans. I'd really like it to remain to be about level 2 and level 3 and not to be distracted by this sort of noise about higher apprenticeships all the time, because I do think it's such a meaningful route way for young people to get into the workforce. I really struggle to talk about apprenticeships in any other context than young people, because that's where I'm so passionate about and I can see it works so well. In my ideal world, I would want the apprenticeship body to be brought back, or some kind of apprenticeship body to be brought back. Perhaps it doesn't have to be national, perhaps it can be local. Perhaps it's about developing the world of the Careers and Enterprise Company and bringing in some kind of apprenticeship piece into that, where individuals can go to get that real impartial support, but also employers can go to get that impartial support. I think one of the issues, and Bally talked about it, she talked about Skills England, she talked about the premise of kind of putting employers around the table to talk about their skills needs. Actually, what we find in Worcestershire, and we've been working with the Chamber of Commerce, the Herefordshire and Worcestershire Chamber of Commerce on the local skills improvement plan. One of the biggest issues that our employers have as small and medium enterprises is they don't know what they need. Quite simply, they don't know. So actually what I would do if I were in government is, yes, I would change the levy. I don't even know if I would keep the levy, if I'm honest, but if I were working with what we had, I would open it up and I would do 2 things. So first of all, I would say if you want to use your levy, you need a workforce plan. And I would actually use some of the levy to pay for that organisation to have that workforce plan developed, because that's crucial. If we don't understand what we need now, in 2 years, in 3 years, in 5 years, we're not considering apprenticeships. If we are, we're putting a round peg in a square hole and just hoping it floats. We really need to have that future thinking. How would that would be so beneficial, not just to our apprenticeship providers, but to our wider education sector, to really understand the needs of our organisations that pay the levy, and hopefully beyond that, but let's start with the levy. So I would get everyone to have a workforce plan that we use some percentage, some money out of the levy to pay for that. I would then possibly strip back the levy to say, and a bit controversially, I'm going to say, keep it all about, keep a percentage of it about young people into the workforce, perhaps up to 30, maybe I'll go up to 30, or perhaps those that don't have a level 2, 3 qualification, using apprenticeships to support them to upskill. but I possibly would remove some of those higher level pieces from the levy, and I would definitely remove upskilling unless it's about that individual getting their first level 2 or their first level 3, where I think it's highly appropriate. I would use the rest of the levy for some flexible training, but my concern with that is, and again, lots of experience of past schemes that have come and gone, is actually we miss the point of it being employer friendly and all about what employers want, because actually we put in a number of bits of bureaucracy to say you can have this course or that course or the other course, but employers didn't want any of those courses in the first place. We have done that before. So I'd like to think we could be more flexible. And my flexibility suggestion would be, we've got a scheme in Worcestershire, which is an upskilling scheme, which is called Skills Boost, and how we've positioned that, and your Bally will recognise this from days gone by. It's not a new idea, it's just a reformed idea, is we've said, okay, you tell us, you go through a skills needs analysis process with us, and in that skills needs analysis process, you identify your training needs. If your training need costs, whatever your training need costs up to a certain amount, we will fund 50% of that. And what I'm suggesting is we fund 50% of that, but we use the levy to do that. That might need a little bit of more of a think through, because ultimately, yes, I suppose the levy is that organisation's money, but I think there's something we could do there to keep it where you have to have a workforce plan, you have to have thought through your strategy, you have to share that strategy. So perhaps you have to publish it on your website, perhaps you have to submit it to your local authority, I don't know. But then we make a proportion of it about those young people or those without a level 2, 3 qualification using for upskilling in apprenticeships. And then the rest of it we make about being flexible for learning and development purposes. I mean, if I were being radical, I'd agree with Bally. I'd make everyone that entered the workforce do an apprenticeship. But as Bally said, it's unlikely to happen. So let's just stick with those that we can get.
You're clearly not as revolutionary and as me then in that case. Judy's probably and radical in that case, which is probably good.
Well, I mean, I do think I think it's a really valid point. And actually, if we went back to the days of, if I think back to kind of like my dad did an apprenticeship at ICI in Cheshire, obviously many years ago. He's 80s, he's late 70s now. That's exactly the expectation though, wasn't it? If you didn't go to do higher education, if that wasn't something you were doing, you did an apprenticeship. So is it that radical, or are we just kind of going back to some old thinking? But I think the other thing I would absolutely do is I would decide what I was going to do, and I would leave it alone, because I think we have tinkered far too much, and I think actually we need to let things evolve and grow and stop tinkering with them.
Totally agreed. And there you go, Vin. If there was ever any evidence that I'm a dinosaur and I'm old school in my thinking, that's just evidence for that from Judy, which I'm absolutely all right with. Over to you, Vin.
Well, whatever is the solution, really, and whatever is going to help boost apprenticeships and grow them in the future. So to everyone who's listening, if you're looking to wear apprenticeships and if you're looking for apprenticeships to thrive and become more and more prominent as an option into boosting your skills or a career or what have you, let's really take into account what both yourself, Bally, and both yourself, Judy, have provided in terms of insights to this podcast. So we'll finish up there. Hopefully the future is bright. Thanks both to yourselves. Bally, thank you so much for your insights here. Judy, it's been a pleasure to have you here as well. Thank you to you both.
Thanks so much, Vin.
Thank you, Vin.
Really good. And Judy, it's been lovely to listen to you. I know I was keen to get you. It's tough to get hold of this lady, but it's very much worth it. And we really appreciate you coming on to this podcast. Thank you so much, Judy.
No problems. Thank you very much, Vin, and thank you, Bally.
And with that, thank you to everyone who's been listening. Thank you again. This has been the Apprenticeship Insights podcast, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Thank you.